Wyoming's best adventure starts in Wind River Country, located in western Wyoming, just beyond Yellowstone National Park and the Grand Teton Mountains. Wind River Country is the place to go to get away from the crowds, unplug, unwind, and find room to roam. Wyoming's Wind River Country, Yellowstone's unique neighbor.
Hey, thanks for listening. I'm Charene, the Adventure Queen, Helen Wilson with the Wind River Visitors Council. We have Anthony Prate with the Rock Shop Inn, where we are actually recording right now. Make sure you check out that accommodations podcast we did with Anthony on the podcast playlist. But we have a really special guest. It's an exciting episode where we get to dive into the world of Sasquatch. I want to introduce John Mionczynski, who is a well-known gentleman in the area. He's well known in his field. John, how about you tell folks a little bit more about yourself, your history, your career?
To summarize quickly, I was a wildlife biologist for 26 years, consulting biologist, which means I didn't really work directly for any agencies. I consulted for many agencies and private organizations, and mostly worked with the bighorn sheep. And I also worked with grizzly bears in Yellowstone Park and the surrounding forests, and some with fire ecology. That's mostly my background as a biologist. I also was an outfitter for 15 years, and I wanted to promote the idea of using goats as pack animals because I invented it for the U.S. Forest Service in 1972 as a way to study bighorn sheep. It was a great job for me because I was selected because I was in a good position to do that. I was not married. I didn't have many responsibilities. My college loan was paid off the year before that, and all I had to do was take whatever job I wanted, and this was offered to me because I had been a horse packer for the Game and Fish Department, and I was not supposed to use goats, but I had goats at home, and they were free range on a BLM range allotment, so I didn't have to be there to take care of them. But one time I was crossing the stream trying to catch up to my band of sheep. I had 17 sheep I was really quite attached to, and they accepted me as not really a member of the tribe, but not a threat. So I could be in with them, and they would sometimes come over and rest, lay their head on my legs while I was sitting on the ground with a spotting scope. So they didn't see me as a threat. That gave me this unique opportunity to live with them and see what they were eating and doing. And this was the first radio telemetry study on bighorn sheep. So the equipment in 1972 was very basic, rudimentary electronic radio tracking equipment, and it was big, heavy, and fragile. I also had to carry a lot of food for being away for months on end, sometimes at least weeks. I was crossing a river one time trying to catch up to my band of sheep that took off in the middle of the night, and it was flood stage of the Little Poposia River, and I went downstream with my heavy backpack and made it to the other side, but my radio equipment was damaged in the water, and I could dry out on the other side, but I knew I had to cross the river again because I was going to have to go to town and get radio equipment fixed. And I was thinking there's got to be a better way to carry a nearly 100-pound pack when I weighed 125 pounds at that time. This light bulb went on that maybe I could pack that goat I had at home. I had 2 goats at home, but one was a female, and the male was pretty big, and I thought I could do that. So while I was home, after crossing that river, I decided I had several days off while they were fixing my radio receiver for tracking the sheep. And I experimented with putting packs on that goat to see if he really could carry it like a horse could. And I built a pack saddle eventually. The first go around, I just put my horse saddlebags on the goat because I didn't think he'd carry much weight, but he could carry a lot of weight without seeming to be affected by it. But I knew enough about horse packing. You could put more on a horse with a saddle than you can without a saddle. So I built a pack saddle that was a mimic of a horse saddle that was smaller. And that was the beginning of goat packing. I took him up in the mountains a few days later, and he was great. And then I went back and got my female goat, and now I had a milk supply that I could make yogurt and cheese out of in the mountains, which was a great benefit when you're carrying all of your food. it became a thing, and I did the entire study using goats as pack animals. Eventually got a few more goats, and each goat was carrying about 50 pounds. The males, anyway, the castrated males are really good hard workers. They don't seem to be affected by the weight of the pack saddle and loads, and it eventually became my business. So when I went into outfitting in the mid-'80s, I used goats to promote the idea of goat packing, but also I was interested in promoting the idea of people going into the Red Desert to see places that are beautiful and very unique. So that was my outfitting beginnings, was going into the Honeycomb Buttes in the Red Desert to introduce people to it, because virtually no one knew where the Red Desert was or how to recreate there. The roads were not very good at that time. But then I expanded into doing scientific packing for the U.S. Geological Survey and the glaciers, because goats are uniquely well adapted to traversing slick, ice-covered terrain in a way that horses and llamas can't. And I was cheaper than helicopters, so I had a business going, working for the U.S. Forest Service, doing acid rain studies, because they were in the high lakes where you couldn't get horses. And we had to get our chemical samples out of the lakes and down to the lab within 24 hours, which meant packing at night, and goats are really good at night packing. It started with scientific packing, and then it evolved into taking fishermen up to high lakes also, and doing plant classes in the Absarokas, where plants are really lush. For 15 years, that was my life. And then also I was a prospector in the Red Desert in the 60s, from 1967 to 1970. I spent my summers in the Red Desert prospecting for jade and gold. So a lot of diverse things that were all fun.
And all of them kept you outside.
Yeah, that was the main thing. I wanted to be outside. Could not stand to have an indoor job.
Something else John Mionczynski is known for is Sasquatch. And John, I feel like that is such a broad topic and sometimes a little taboo as well when you converse with folks. And so I really want to talk to you about information on Sasquatch and your view as being a wildlife biologist and somebody who's lived outside most of your life.
It is a taboo subject, and I've suffered a lot of criticism from my colleagues who are biologists for even talking about the subject, and I was even threatened with my job when I worked for Game and Fish for talking about it. It's just one of those things. But my first and foremost allegiance is to science. I'm a scientist. And when you're presented with a lot of evidence that seems to indicate there's something there, then I think you're negligent if you don't pursue it. Although I've suffered criticism for my scientific background in association with Sasquatch, I think my colleagues who won't address it and won't even read the literature that's out there are more delinquent than I am in the scientific allegiance. So I really would not have been interested in Sasquatch other than it's a fascinating idea that I was introduced to in college in 1967. There was an article in Argosy magazine that got circulated around the college dorm, including photographs of a supposed Sasquatch taken by these two cowboys that were out in the mountains in California. And that film was highly suspect by a lot of people as being a fake, but it was an interesting idea that exposed me to the concept of maybe there's another primate on this continent that we missed somehow. I took that with a grain of salt and then became a biologist and went to work and had an encounter in the mountains in this same study I told you about with bighorn sheep. So that was in 1972. And I had something come into my camp that I assumed was a bear because it was big and I could hear it breathing. And it was attracted to the side of my tent that I knew somebody had spilt bacon grease on. And I was warned by the assistant ranger when I took that tent out of the warehouse not to take that one up because the guy that spilt bacon grease on it didn't have a chance to wash it yet. It was the only tent left, and it was the right one that I needed, anticipating that until I had a chance to clean it, I might attract a bear. And I did not have a chance to clean it because it was the first night out with that tent up at about 9,500 feet in the forest, that just outside of Lander, that something came to the tent and it kept coming back to it, even though I would shout and try to scare it away. It was poking its nose into the side of the tent, right where the bacon grease was. It was an obvious stain. So I was sure it was a bear. And we have a lot of bears in that part of the mountains. And when it would poke its nose into that bacon stain, I'd hit it with the back of my hand. It was around midnight. And shout at the same time, make a loud yip, and it ran off, and it ran behind some thicket of pine trees, and I could still hear it breathing, which was a little odd, because I didn't think bears made that much noise breathing. It was more like an excited elk resonance in the lungs that was creating this breathing sound. And it came back after 45 minutes or so, and I don't remember the time, but it was a long time ago. It came back and did that 2 other times, and the third time I hit it, there was a indent on the side of the tent, and I hit it with the back of my hand and made a sound again. And this time I hit a kneecap, I think, because the shadow in the moonlight was standing above my tent the third time, and it wasn't the first 2 times. And when I hit it, its breathing changed, its breathing sound changed, and I saw a silhouette in the moonlight on the top of my tent, which was a 6-foot-high tent. And it was not a bear paw, it was a hand with an opposed thumb. So that was one red flag that I was dealing with something else. It fell over on my tent. I think it thought it put its hand on something solid, and of course it was a nylon tent. So it went down over my legs and then got up and ran off behind those trees again, but I could hear it breathing. And I went outside the tent, built my fire back up, and sat there with a sleeping bag over me, looking at the direction of that breathing behind those dog hair pines. And I didn't see it because it was a thicket of pines and a lot of shadow there. But I could still hear it breathing. Eventually, adrenaline causes you to get excited, and then you get tired. And I fell asleep by the fire and woke up to the sound of something that startled me. And I didn't know what it was at first, and then I saw a pine cone seemingly fall out of a tree, and it was the same sound, so I knew the first one was a pine cone, but there was no wind blowing. And then another pine cone got lobbed at me, and I could see it coming in from where the breathing sound was. Over the course of, I think, the next, not quite an hour, I had about 20 pine cones thrown at me. So now we're talking maybe a human that's playing a trick on me. But after a while, it left, and there were no tracks because I was in pine duff. That's why I put my tent there. It's nice, soft pine duff floor to lay a tent on. I looked around for tracks and never found any. But that was my first experience, and I told my boss about it when I came out of the mountains. He was the forest ranger. Doc Smith was his name, in the 70s. And when he heard the story, he got up and he closed the door so the secretary wouldn't hear our conversation in the other room. And he said, "Have you ever heard of Sasquatch?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "What do you think about it?" And I said, "I don't know. I don't really think I ever had any particular interest in it as a real animal. I just thought it was an interesting idea when I read that Argosy magazine article that what a neat thing if we would have a primate in North America. That went undiscovered. Anyway, he started to tell me about all the sightings that had been reported that month that I had my experience, which was in September of 1972. And while I was gone, the newspapers were full of interviews with people that said they'd seen a big hairy primate up in the mountains close to where I was. And he said, "We don't know that there's such a thing." But he said, "I have to tell you, my best friend, who I went to college with, also became a forest ranger in the Uinta National Forest. And he had seen in broad daylight a Sasquatch run across an open meadow. And came to a buck and pole fence and didn't climb over it, just never broke its stride and ran over it, which a human would have a lot of trouble doing. And it was a hairy, man-looking animal that was about 7.5 or 8 feet tall. And that's what people were reporting in the Wind River Range at that time. It was in the local Lander Journal and had made the national news. And before I came out of the mountains, this ranger said he's faced with a problem because it made it to national news and people were flying into Lander, big game hunters, wanting to know from the ranger where the last sighting was so they could go shoot one. And he said the dilemma he was in is if this is a man in a monkey suit and he gets killed because I told somebody where to find it, he's implicated in the murder. And on that basis, he could ask me to follow up on these sightings and see if they could come up with physical evidence of a primate or a guy in a monkey suit. So that became my job after that for a while. And it was an interesting job because I interviewed the people that were in the newspapers and some other folks that had turned in sightings to the ranger, but weren't in newspaper articles because they didn't want their name associated with it. And about 25 people were on a list that I could interview. And it was very interesting because I think only one of them was faking it and the others were pretty honest and straightforward, I think, describing something unusual that they had seen. And in one of those cases, I interviewed this man quite a lot, and he had reason to shoot this thing that he saw, and it was in his garden stealing vegetables when he shot it. And it went over. He thought he killed it, but then it got up and ran away. So he reported it to the sheriff because he saw the face and he said it looked like a human, and he reported it as a deformed human of some sort. And that was one of the reports that I was alerted to that I could go to that had happened right while I was doing my investigations. So it was fresh. And that was exactly what we wanted, to get physical evidence. So I went there and found hair samples all over the garden fence and sent them off. I took them actually to the Game and Fish Lab because I knew everybody at the Game and Fish Lab, and part of my training was there in Laramie. And I took it to the head veterinarian, Tom Thorne, who thought this was an interesting thing, and he gave it to a hair analyst that they had. And he was not allowed to say anything except that it was not a wildlife species native to Wyoming.
Wow.
His boss had already talked to him because of all these newspaper articles that it would be inappropriate for him to say anything about a Bigfoot animal. He said, all I can tell you officially is these hair samples are of a certain type. They're definitely not an animal native to Wyoming.
As a scientist, you know that's all they can really say, but
yeah.
that's important.
That's important,
yeah.
Yes. But what he said unofficially to me is, these are primate hairs. And since it's not native to Wyoming, I can't say any more than that. But he said, I know from my technical training in hair analysis that these are the kind of hairs he associated with primates. So he said, I suggest you go down the hall, because the Game and Fish Lab at that time was in the science building at UW. And he said, go down to the anthropology department and talk to George Gill, who's the head of the department. And that's his bag, primates, and see if he can help you. So I did that same day. I went down to see George Gill, and he was interested in the sightings, and he had read the newspaper articles. And he said, I know just who to send this to. We'll send it to Dr. Walter Berkby at Arizona State University. And Berkby was the only primate hair expert in the world. He had a collection of all of the hairs, typical type specimens of hairs from every primate species in the world. He will be the one person that we can send this to see what primate it is, if it's a primate. And that's what he did. George Gill sent it off. While I was still in the office, he said, I've got to warn you, though, he's been very outspoken about the existence of Bigfoot and the fact that it's probably a big fat myth. And there is no such thing as Bigfoot or Sasquatch. Two names for the same thing. A few weeks later, he got a phone call saying that he looked at the hair specimen and it's definitely primate, and it definitely doesn't match any known primates. So he didn't go so far as to say this is Sasquatch, because he was never going to do that. That was encouraging enough that all the guys in the lab were very much interested in Sasquatch from that time on. And they would actually wait for my phone calls every week or two to see what new discoveries have come out of the Wind Rivers. But they couldn't do it officially. They had to be very quiet about it. And that's where my job was threatened. I was called in by the head of the research division at Game and Fish, and along with the veterinarians who had expressed an interest in it, and told that our jobs were not secure if we started talking about Bigfoot. So we all became pretty quiet about it. But I continued to interview people that had sightings and reports, and followed up with tracks and made plaster casts of tracks, and had no more hair samples after that. I work now with Dr. Jeff Meldrum. We teamed up about 20 years later. I knew he was doing research, and he had heard about me doing quiet research over here in the Wind Rivers. He'd been doing research in Idaho and Oregon and Washington and California. And he had lots of plaster casts. I had actually been asked by Grover Krantz. Dr. Grover Krantz was an anthropologist at Washington State University. He was leading the charge through the 60s and 70s on the actual science of studying this phenomenon. And he had well over 200 plaster casts of primate tracks from the Blue Mountains of Washington. And he had heard of me and asked me to join up with him. He offered me quite a bit of funding to go out and actually shoot one, and I didn't really want to shoot one, so I didn't take him up on it. His lab, after he died, was eventually turned over to Dr. Jeff Meldrum at Idaho State University, and he and I got together, looked at all of his plaster casts and the rationale for why these are real dynamic foot tracks rather than fakes. But we're talking about human-looking tracks that are 18 to 22 inches long. So they're twice the size of human tracks or more. And he had some information based on track evidence and stories from people. And I had evidence from stories that I followed up on and found there was a consistency in seasonality, which is what you would do if you were trying to do a wildlife study on a mysterious, elusive animal, is to find out if there's any seasonality that will confirm a food source, a seasonal food source. So these sightings should occur in places where you'd expect to find a seasonal food source every year, and they would move from there to other food sources. And I came to the conclusion it was an omnivore that had similar food habits to bears. And
So scavenging, more or less, or?
Yes, scavenging for food, probably killing fresh meat most of the time, but also capable of scavenging for dead animals, which humans wouldn't do, but mostly vegetarian, like bears. And I had worked 3 years for the interagency grizzly bear study team. Was familiar with grizzly bear food habits in this area. And Jeff Meldrum and I compared our notes and found that there was a lot of overlapping conclusions that we came to, and we decided to join forces, and we formed a group called the North American Ape Project, which started in North America and then eventually ended up doing studies in Siberia and Western China also, which has a similar animal in the mountains called a Yeren. We started compiling Native American anecdotal stories along with the Chinese stories, and learning from that more about where they might live, how they might live. And in fact, I've done a couple of presentations on hibernation of Sasquatches and how we know that happens and how they have the genetic makeup for that, because the other primates do. And we actually did some of these presentations, Jeff and I, for the National Wildlife Society, and we were not kicked out. We got very good response to this subject. But on the local level, it's still considered scientific heresy to even speak of possibility of a big hairy primate running around the map.
I think it's great chatting with you, and I love sound science. I'm a big fan of that. I think that most things can have a scientific approach. I think it's really important.
So, John, my question to you before you start playing piano. A lot of people assume that Sasquatch or Bigfoot or whatever name you put to him or her is a singular solitary creature. Do you think this is a species with many?
Yeah, the scientific estimates, several biologists are involved in studying different aspects of this. And Jeff Meldrum's estimate agrees with most of the other scientists. John Bindernagel was one in Canada that had a lot of data on it. Probably only 2,000 left in North America, mostly in Canada.
So definitely endangered.
Yeah, definitely endangered, because now we're talking about probably small family groups that are remnants of former populations. When you talk about the Native American interpretation of this, they said they were fairly common at one time, and they were here when the native people arrived. There's a lot of confusion in names. The Shoshone name in this area in Idaho for this being, because they don't consider it an animal, they consider it a human, is Nawazi, which means the lost brother. And I asked them to define that. I worked for the Native Memory Project for the last 20 years, and we interview Native people for their traditions, so that especially traditional knowledge that is in danger of being lost to time. But now they're more talkative, and they say there used to be quite a few of them, and they had rules, boundary rules between where the Nawazi people could live and where the culture people could live. The term lost brother referred to the fact that they had no culture. It meant they lived like bears, and that's why they have hair all over their bodies, and they don't have structures, houses they live in. They don't have a history of their ancestors, which is part of culture. So they live like bears, but they're still revered as the ones who came before. They all had stories about them being the people who lived here before cultural humans existed. And to my mind, that speaks to the possibility of proto-humans, which are in the fossil record. There's 22 proto-humans in the fossil record that were not quite human, but very close to it. They developed the running foot over time from an arboreal type of grasping foot. And that was Dr. Meldrum's specialty. Most of his papers he's published were on the evolution of bipedalism in humans. So he knows about that evolution and how it eventually went through all the proto-humans out of Africa. Anyway, I can get carried away on that subject, but that was a good question.
If a lost brother were to walk into the saloon right now, what would you play for him?
Probably this one. That was Snow Deer, an old saloon song.
How long have you been playing piano? That's amazing.
Oh, about 10 minutes.
No, really.
Minutes, 10 decades. She was counting.
I started when I was in high school. I really wanted to play piano, and my folks said if I worked and raised enough money to buy one, I could have one. So I worked on a farm all summer, made enough money to buy an old wrecked piano, and taught myself to play.
Wow, you taught yourself. That's really good.
Do you live in the area, John, out here, South Pass area?
I live in Atlantic City.
A lot of history around
Just
here.
about 5 miles from this place, this rock shop inn, and that makes it pretty handy on weekends.
This is a cool area, though, and a lot of people don't really know about South Pass, Atlantic City.
That's right. It's maybe, I would say, the most fascinating area in Wyoming, historically, first of all. Fascinating place. And I play piano there in the Miners Exchange Saloon every Gold Rush Days, which is our big annual celebration around here.
What's one of your favorite tunes to play at the old Exchange Saloon in South Pass City? Something that just rings a bell.
Some of the old stuff from the Oregon Trail days, because South Pass City largely was populated by people who came in wagons on the Oregon Trail. Sweet Betsy from Pike was one that was popular at that time.
Do you play here at the weekends or ever?
Yes.
Okay, can you tell us about that?
They're some of the funnest times you can have in Wyoming. Saturday nights at the Rock Shop Inn are just amazingly communal group. Not like most of the bars you go into. But if you don't know anybody when you walk in, by the time an hour is gone, you'll know a lot of locals because it's just a friendly place. And that's what I like about it. It's not just a bar, it's a community center and weekly convention center where you find out what's been going on.
Can people come and chat with you about
yeah.
Sasquatch or medicinal plants, or
All of
try
that.
not to work too much?
No, that's not work for me.
Good.
I like talking about plants. Yeah, I'm an ethnobotanist now. That's what I do with the tribes. So I talk with people about the latest plants that are up and how we could use them. But I play piano a lot, so I don't do a lot of talking.
So what do you think the antagonistic behavior was of throwing the pine cones at you?
Oh, I found out what it was.
It was
our
humans?
studies were pretty intensive over the last 25 years, and we've interviewed a lot of people, including going to reservations and asking people to offer up information. And usually they are resistant to that. But we got people at Fort Hall to come up, and we had about 80 interviews one day after we did a talk and asked for people to give us some traditional knowledge on this being. And they did. And one of the stories we heard repeatedly was my experience. They come to somebody's house usually. I was in a tent, but usually they say they'll come to your house and they'll let you know they're there somehow. They might throw a rock on your roof. And then they make this sound, which was what I heard. And they described it, several people described it to me in detail, because I used to describe it as a very deep-throated cat purring. Well, when a cat purrs, you hear it when it's exhaling, and you hear it change to an inhale, and then it changes to exhaling. And it's still purring no matter which way the breath is going. And that's what I heard. And they said when it does that, it's like a snoring sound. That's like a man snoring, but it's on the inhale and the exhale. It's like an elk. Before an elk bugles, it makes a very deep sound. Feel it in your lungs. It makes your lungs resonate. And that's what I heard. So this is a big lung capacity. And what Jeff Meldrum has been working on is that the lower primates have pharyngeal air pockets above the lungs that are designed specifically to make very deep, low-pitched sounds. And they use them to communicate certain things. That's what I heard. I'm sure these animals have those pharyngeal air sacs too, probably related to orangutan. We think the closest relative to the Bigfoot is orangutan. And they make a sound that is very deep, and low-pitched sounds carry further than high-pitched sounds. They described it and said when you hear that, it's traditional amongst the Shoshones in Fort Hall Reservation, which is a winter range for Sasquatches, according to them. Then you are supposed to put food out for them because they expect it from interlopers. We've been here for only maybe 12, 13,000 years, and they were here first. So they expect some kind of tribute. So he said all of these Shoshones and Bannocks said that when they heard that sound outside their window, they would go to the refrigerator and load up a bucket with random foods and put it out on the porch. And the next morning, the bucket would be gone. And a few days later, the empty bucket would be back on the porch. But anytime they heard that sound, they knew that was a request for food. And if you didn't give it to them, they would throw things at your house, like rocks.
So had you left something, maybe the pine cones would have stopped.
I just didn't know the rules.
You didn't know, yeah.
But it was really enlightening talking to the tribal members who have this ancient knowledge, this tribal knowledge about this, because they had a lot of details on that. And there's some stories they told me I'm not allowed to repeat, but they're very detailed stories of an intimate relationship between these mountain people and the people with culture.
Any petroglyphs that might have come about that you think?
Oh yeah, they're all over. I think people misinterpret them sometimes as other things because they're not really thinking about Sasquatch as a topic for petroglyphs. But I found them in Red Canyon and in the Red Desert. And I work for the Native Memory Project, and we actually interviewed quite a few tribal members on that subject of Sasquatch. And one of them was in the Red Desert with a Shoshone elder who talked about personal experiences with Sasquatch at a petroglyph panel that showed Sasquatch standing next to some people with spears and shields. So it's pretty well documented on petroglyphs, and of course the Indians would have been intimately familiar with Sasquatch as an animal because they know animals very well. They live with them and they relate to them as food and as cohabitants of their world. They depict Sasquatch most of the time as a footprint, and they'll sometimes, like in Red Canyon, show human footprints which have an indentation for the instep, the 5 toes, the foot that looks like a human track, and instep indentation. But when they show a Sasquatch footprint, it'll look just like that without the instep, which is exactly the way their tracks look, because they have a flat foot with an articulated mid-tarsal region. So their tracks are different from human tracks, and this is all well documented and published by Jeff Meldrum. Their track is more like an ape track in that the mid-tarsal flexion does not occur in humans. So we have an arch that's rigid. With the lower apes, the foot conforms to the medium that it's walking on. So sometimes it's raised up when there's a stick, and sometimes it's depressed in the middle of the foot track where there's soft mud. So that's better weight distribution, but it probably means they don't run as well as humans do, which is supported by all the sightings.
Which is why they probably would also try to stay less seen if they know they can't outrun or defend themselves in that.
They bound, and you can bound in the open, but you can't bound in the forest, which is their habitat. But where they've been seen out in the open, and I should say, a lot of our sightings come to us confidentially where we're not allowed to use the person's name. From Forest Service people, backcountry trail crews, Park Service rangers, they just don't want their name associated with the report. But some of those talk about them bounding, get down on their hind legs and bound like a deer for 30 feet. Humans can't do that. So they're different than us in behavioral ways and in anatomical ways.
You're a fascinating individual. I hope people who come and visit Wind River Country realize that we have a resource like yourself and contact you, whether it be about a medicinal plant hike, maybe their interest in Sasquatch, maybe they're just coming to the Rock Shop Inn on a Saturday night to see John on the beautiful piano. But John, is there anything that you wish people take from this when it comes to Sasquatch or just the beautiful area, South Pass City, Atlantic City, the Rock Shop Inn?
It's a good thing to visit the South Pass area in general because it's part of Wyoming history that's essential to understand why Wyoming is the way it is and why it's the equality state. The people at South Pass City Historic Site have done a wonderful job of telling that story, and it gets visited by a lot of people every year, but I think a lot of people in Lander and Rock Springs don't know about it. They're not on the tourist route. They live here, so they're not a tourist. So I think anybody really should pay attention to the fact that there's a lot going on here. There's a couple of really good establishments in Atlantic City and lodging places in Atlantic City that are all pretty rustic.
The Mercantile and the Grubstake.
The Mercantile and the Grubstake. So the Mercantile is on the list, what do they call it? The Federal Register of
National
Historic Places. And so is Miner's Delight Inn, which is an old hotel.
We'll get there eventually.
We've got a lot going on that's more on a small scale than the bigger towns.
We appreciate you, John Mionczynski, Anthony Prate, Helen Wilson. I'm Charene Herrera. This has been another episode of Wyoming's Wind River Country, Yellowstone's unique neighbor, and we'll have John back and we'll do a medicinal plant hike, so look forward to that.
Thanks for tuning in to Wyoming's Wind River Country, Yellowstone's unique neighbor. Visit us at windriver.org and follow Wyoming's Wind River Country on Facebook and Instagram. This podcast has been brought to you by the Wind River Visitors Council.